Intro hook. Imagine this. You are stuck in the coldest, most isolated place on Earth. No internet.
No phones. No GPS.
No way to even send a message for help. The temperature?
-40 degrees.
The food? Almost gone. And the worst part? Your ship, the only thing that could take you back home, is now destroyed, crushed by the brutal Antarctic ice. 28 men stranded for nearly 500 days. Everyone believed they were dead, but somehow they survived. This is the unbelievable, jaw-dropping story of Sir Ernest Shackleton's Endurance expedition. A story that has been called the greatest survival story in human history. To understand the story, we need to go back to the year 1914. The world was on the brink of the First World War. But one man had a completely different obsession. Not war, not politics, not money, but the icy, untouched continent of Antarctica. That man was Ernest Shackleton. He was an explorer, born in Ireland, who had already attempted to reach the South Pole before. In fact, a few years earlier, he had gotten closer to the South Pole than anyone else in history at that time, only 97 miles away, but had to turn back to save his men. For Shackleton, failure wasn't the end. It was a sign. I'll be back. Now, in 1914, Shackleton announced his most ambitious dream: to cross the entire continent of Antarctica on foot, from one side to the other. A journey of more than 1,800 miles across the most dangerous landscape in the world. The name of the ship chosen for this mission? Quite symbolic: Endurance. Shackleton gathered 28 men for this epic adventure. Some were experienced sailors, others were scientists, doctors, carpenters, even a photographer named Frank Hulley, whose camera would later capture some of the most iconic images in exploration history. In August 1914, just as Europe was plunging into World War I, Shackleton's expedition set sail from London. They traveled south, stopping in Buenos Aires and finally reaching the whaling station on the island of South Georgia. Local whalers there warned Shackleton, "This year, the ice is especially bad. The Weddell Sea is completely choked. If you go now, your ship will not make it." But Shackleton was not a man to turn back. He pushed forward. By December 1914, the Endurance sailed deep into the Weddell Sea, a place sailors called the most treacherous waters on Earth. Here, enormous sheets of ice floated endlessly. Imagine massive white deserts of frozen water, shifting, cracking, colliding with each other like giant tectonic plates. At first, progress was slow but steady. The men laughed, played football on the ice, and even brought their dogs out to run around. They thought it was all part of the adventure. But soon, the ice closed in. The Endurance was surrounded. By January 1915, just weeks after entering the Weddell Sea, the ship became completely trapped, frozen in place. Imagine a wooden ship stuck in solid ice, hundreds of miles from any human settlement. The men waited, believing the summer sun would eventually melt the ice and free the ship. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, but the ice only grew thicker. At first, the mood was hopeful. Shackleton organized games, had the men sing songs, and even celebrated birthdays. He knew morale was just as important as food or shelter. But as time went on, reality set in. The Endurance was no longer a ship, it had become a prison. Temperatures dropped lower and lower. Supplies were being eaten up. And worst of all, the ice began crushing the wooden hull. The men could hear it at night, the sound of the ship creaking, bending, groaning under the enormous pressure. One sailor described it as if a giant hand was squeezing the life out of the Endurance. They were stuck, trapped in the middle of nowhere, and winter was coming. The men realized they were no longer on an expedition. They were on a survival mission. Month after month, the ship remained frozen in place. Outside, the Antarctic winter unleashed its fury. Temperatures dropped to -40, storms howled endlessly, and the sun disappeared for months at a time. To survive, Shackleton ordered the men to move onto the ice itself. They built makeshift camps right next to the trapped ship. Tents made of canvas, sleeping bags made of reindeer skin, and tiny stoves burning whatever fuel they had left. Food became a daily worry. They rationed biscuits, dried meat, and pemmican. When supplies began running low, they started hunting seals and penguins. Imagine, your entire survival depends on whether you can catch an animal in sub-zero winds. But Shackleton knew, physical survival was only half the battle. The bigger enemy was despair. So he made sure the men played football on the ice, held dog races, and even staged comedy shows. His leadership style was clear: keep the men busy, keep them hopeful. By October 1915, after nearly 10 months trapped, the ice pressure reached its peak. The men gathered around the Endurance, listening in horror as the ship's timbers groaned and cracked. Suddenly, a loud boom echoed. The hull splintered. Water rushed in. Shackleton gave the order: abandon ship. The men scrambled to save whatever they could: food rations, sled dogs, scientific instruments, and most importantly, the 3 lifeboats. Photographer Frank Hulley even risked his life diving into freezing water to save glass photo plates. He later destroyed the less important ones, so only the best 150 images would survive. But nothing could save the ship itself. Day after day, the men watched helplessly as the Endurance was crushed like a toy between slabs of ice. On November 21, 1915, the Endurance slipped beneath the frozen sea. Their home, their hope, their last connection to the outside world gone. Now the men were truly alone. Imagine 28 humans standing on drifting ice floes, surrounded by endless frozen desert, thousands of kilometers from civilization. No radio, no GPS, no way to call for help. It wasn't just about surviving the cold anymore. It was about finding a way back to the world. Shackleton gathered his men and told them, "Ship and stores have gone, so now we'll go home." Those words were powerful. Even in total disaster, Shackleton projected confidence. He never allowed despair to spread. This, more than anything else, would keep the men alive. For the next several months, the men camped on drifting ice floes. These giant floating sheets of ice slowly moved with ocean currents, carrying the men farther and farther north. It was like being passengers on a moving iceberg. But as the Antarctic summer approached, the floes began to melt and break apart. Their icy platform was disappearing beneath their feet. The only option left: the 3 lifeboats they had saved from the Endurance. Tiny, open boats, barely strong enough to face calm seas, let alone the furious Southern Ocean. And yet, Shackleton knew, this was their only chance. For 7 days, they fought through blizzards, icy winds, and waves as tall as buildings. Salt water soaked their clothes. Ice froze on their faces. Men collapsed from exhaustion, vomiting from seasickness, barely able to row. But finally, after a week of hell, they spotted land. An uninhabited, rocky island called Elephant Island. When they stumbled ashore, some men fell to their knees and kissed the ground. For the first time in over a year, they were standing on solid land. At first, the men rejoiced, but soon they realized Elephant Island was not salvation. It was just another prison. The island was isolated, battered by storms, and far from any shipping routes. No one would ever come here by chance. If they stayed, they would die. The nearest inhabited place was the whaling station on South Georgia Island, 800 miles away, across the stormiest seas in the world. A journey many experts considered impossible, even with a proper ship. And Shackleton was about to attempt it in a lifeboat. Shackleton chose his best lifeboat, the James Caird. He reinforced it with wood and canvas to make it slightly more seaworthy. Then he picked a small crew of 5 men to join him: Frank Worsley, the brilliant navigator; Tom Crean, the tough Irishman, and 3 others. The rest, 22 men, would remain on Elephant Island, under the command of Frank Wild. Before leaving, Shackleton gave Wild one simple order: pack up your things every morning, because I'll be back. On April 24, 1916, Shackleton and his 5 men set sail in the James Caird, on what would become the most extraordinary open boat journey ever attempted. For 17 days, they battled the fury of the Southern Ocean. Freezing gales, 50-foot waves, constant bailing of water, and salt sores that burned their skin. Navigating only by sextant, Worsley somehow kept them on course. Finally, on May 10, 1916, after sailing 800 miles, the exhausted crew sighted South Georgia Island. But they had landed on the wrong side. Between them and the whaling station lay mountains and glaciers, land never crossed by humans. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean trekked for 36 hours non-stop across jagged peaks and frozen valleys. Finally, they reached the whaling station at Stromness. The workers there stared in shock. These men looked like walking ghosts. Shackleton had reached civilization. But 22 men were still waiting. The whalers gave Shackleton a ship, but when he tried to sail back to Elephant Island, ice blocked the way. He tried again with another vessel, blocked again, and again. 3 times Shackleton attempted to rescue his men. 3 times the Antarctic ice pushed him back. Finally, on August 30th, 1916, after 4 long months of desperate attempts, Shackleton secured a small Chilean ship called the Yelcho. As the Yelcho approached Elephant Island, the men on shore spotted a tiny dot on the horizon. Could it be? Suddenly, cheers erupted. They rushed to the shore, waving frantically. And then they saw him, Shackleton, returning just as he had promised. When Shackleton stepped onto the beach, his first question was, "All well?" Frank Wild answered, "All safe, all well." Not a single man had died. Every one of Shackleton's 28 men had survived nearly 2 years stranded in the most hostile place on Earth. It was a miracle of endurance, leadership, and sheer human spirit. So, how did Shackleton succeed where so many others failed? It wasn't luck. It was leadership. He always put his men before himself. He gave up his own tent, his own warm sleeping bag, to keep weaker men alive. He kept morale high with jokes, songs, and hope, even when things looked hopeless. And most importantly, he never broke his promise. Today, Shackleton is remembered not for reaching the South Pole, not for crossing Antarctica, but for something far greater, saving every single one of his men against all odds. This story is not just about history. It's about us. In our lives, we face our own Antarctic winters. Moments where everything seems lost, when the ice is crushing us, when hope is fading. But Shackleton's story teaches us. True leadership is about responsibility. Courage is not the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it. And no matter how impossible things may look, endurance, hope, and unity can carry us through. So the next time you feel like giving up, remember Shackleton and his 28 men, stranded for 500 days, with no ship, no technology, no help from the outside world. And yet, they survived. Because sometimes survival is not about strength. It's about endurance. This, truly, was the greatest survival story in human history.